I remember the first time I watched Nagi no Asukara back in 2014 and how it skyrocketed its way to becoming my second favorite anime at the time. I was still quite infatuated with melodramatic storytelling and love polygons, so Okada Mari's storytelling had a way of hooking me in. And even now, I still consider this to be one of my favorite shows. I mean, think about it this way, it's Anohana, but with more time for the characters and story to develop and without the weird idea that Ghost Menma suddenly becomes an actual physical entity towards the end. But with a story so heavily focused on the themes of adolescent love, dealing with change, and acceptance of the self and others, there are a lot of emotional elements that need to be covered in the soundtrack. After all, the atmosphere of any show or film is determined by the sounds of the world it takes place in. And the way that this was handled by the show's 5 composers, Dewa Yoshiaki, Watanabe Zentaro, Sai Genji, Depapepe, and Kawata Shunsuke, can be broken down into a few different categories. Roughly half of Nagiasu takes place underwater, or if not actually underwater, then near water, or heavily involving the characters from Underwater Village Shioshishio. Water is not a particularly difficult sound to represent in music, as it can easily be associated with reverb. Reverb is essentially the sound of a space that kind of defines how big or small it is without seeing it, and what kind of materials it might be made of. If you were to clap or shout in a wooden or marble cathedral, it would sound a lot larger and more hollow than your carpeted bedroom. This reverberant sound is even referred to as wetness, with the dry sound being the original sound, such as the clap or shout. And so, when the reverb is increased, so too is the naturally wet sound, and thus music associated with water is easy to create, at least in theory. For example, a highly reverberant piano sounds like this. You can hear the notes sort of droning on even after they've been played, creating this atmosphere that surrounds you, not too dissimilar to the idea of being underwater. But instead of being enveloped in water, you're enveloped by lingering sounds. But applying reverb to an instrument only does part of the job, as the actual musical writing needs to supplement the effect. The high piano melody of what we just heard leaves a lot of spaces between notes, leading to a sparse sound to represent a feeling of loneliness or longing. The bass line that runs up and down open chords without stopping is more representative of the uncertain feelings each character experiences throughout the story, wondering if it's alright for them to feel the way they do, or if change is something they should allow or fight against. Perhaps this reverberant sound is more representative of the solitude of being lost in one's thoughts, so let's take a listen to a track where the idea of water is much more obviously at the forefront. It's pretty clear that there's a lot more reverb in the piano with this one, but that alone isn't what makes this one track so much more water-like. The added presence of the bowed vibraphone and light synth pads playing at low and high registers creates this sort of open sound that somehow manages to sound both empty and full at the same time, due to the resonance of the instruments themselves, as well as the reverb effects added to them. The piano is more of an effect than an actual melodic line, sparkling with high notes like lights reflecting off the rippling surface of the sea. As the less reverberant instruments like the flute, horn, drums, and strings come in, the image of breaking the surface comes to mind, keeping the idea of water present with the vibraphone, synths, and piano, but allowing the drier instruments to weave themselves in and out of the wet sounds of the music. And this isn't only present in the music, as even underwater scenes without music often contain a sort of low rumbling sound, almost like wind, except less abrasive and more continuous. Not unlike how sound just kind of blends together when you're submerged in water.
ヒー君が頑張ってるのはいつもだけど、でも違う頑張りっていうか。
The style of music also plays a huge role in creating the atmosphere of the music, as we heard with Doko made mo fukaku. While the story and soundtrack aren't without fun, lighthearted tracks, it's the heavier emotional ones that resonate with the more dramatic themes of the show, and ultimately help bring to life the director's intentions. In a previous video, I talked about minimalism in music, and how the basic idea behind it is to make small changes on repetitive patterns over a long period of time. And this is the basis behind a ton of the music in Nagi, and for good reason. In that same video before, I also talked a bit about the piece Marine Snow, which had what sounded like two time signatures playing over top of one another. This track is minimalism in its most basic form, with basically no changes in the actual musical parts, evolving the music by adding and removing layers as opposed to actually writing new melodic or harmonic lines. While this may sound like a lazy way to write music, this is actually one of the most effective ways to create atmospheric background tracks without stealing attention away from the visuals, while also forcing the composer to come up with interesting ways to keep the listener engaged. Case in point, by having a 5/4 ostinato play above a 4/4 band setup, the track essentially plays something different for 20 bars before actually repeating itself. And that doesn't take into account the phrasing of each individual band instrument, with each one having patterns of differing lengths. What this does is make sure that the track doesn't actually repeat anything exactly the same at any given time, despite the fact that it might sound so circular and repetitive. And that's exactly why minimalism is so fitting for the core themes of the show. Many of the characters fret over the changes that come about by simply living life, and so they brood and stew over trying to hold on to what they once held dear, despite this keeping them from moving forward. Others try to force themselves to move forward while foregoing their true feelings without realizing that they may be rushing too far ahead in an attempt to compensate for the changes in their environment. And ultimately what happens is that everyone just moves slowly whether they want to or not, only changing as much as the world will actually allow them to because, well, that's just how life is. And the use of repetitive music that only makes small changes over long periods of time is exactly like how the characters and us regular people are able to live our lives. To show a great example of how this is put to use, Uroko Sama no Monogatari is the track that plays when Uroko Sama recounts the days when he was one with the sea god, explaining the true history and fate of Ojoshi Sama. The guitar and shamisen pluck away a repetitive pattern while percussive instruments layer on top of them as the piece continues along. There's a shift in the music as a watery filter washes over the ensemble, giving the piano a slightly out-of-tune honky-tonk sort of sound, while the guitar is replaced with the more resonant harp to give the repetitive pattern a more watery sound. This section is then followed by the final one, where the piano and guitar play a new pattern in unison, with the guitar forming the basis while the piano slowly begins to improvise new harmonies around it. The strings also come in to bring out some more supporting harmonies, but the piece never grows too much as this is merely a story from Uroko-sama's past. While the events of the story itself might have changing levels of intensity, the outcome cannot be changed, and thus the piece never builds to a point of climax and resolution, merely fading out with the end of the story. We've covered atmosphere and minimalism, and I could honestly leave it at that as far as covering how the soundtrack accomplished the goal of telling the story through sound. But there's one more thing that I think needs to be mentioned, and that is the scale of the musical ensembles being used in relation to the actual sounds being output. Simply put, a lot of the arrangements use far less instruments than the final product would have you believe. Sure, many of the pieces in the soundtrack are just a couple of acoustic guitars or piano solos, but let's take a listen to one of the more deceptively larger sounding tracks and break down how such a large sound can be created with only a few instruments. right away we're struck with a series of piano chords. The melody itself doesn't move around a whole lot, and there are never more than 3 notes playing simultaneously at any given time. Also, the track starts with notes that are relatively close together, never going outside of 2 octaves of one another, and all playing at a relatively unemotional register. For heavy, ominous sounds you would play lower, and for lighter, fluttery sounds you would play higher. This makes the piece begin feeling sort of confined, like we're trapped in a box of some sort. And this is exactly what Watanabe was trying to accomplish, as Suri nukeru kokoro, meaning heart that slips by, begins with the feeling of your chest tightening up when you've seen or heard something you didn't want or expect to. The melody stutters, unable to get a full sound out aside from the occasional chord, but even those chords are weak and trip over themselves. Whenever this track plays, there's been a misunderstanding or a personal secret has been revealed to the last person they wanted to hear it. After a repetition of these confined chords, a string quartet suddenly starts flowing out, spilling into a much more fully realized melody and harmony. Tears of sadness, embarrassment, anger, failure, frustration, all of these are falling out like streams faster than the piano is able to contain, and now everything is coming to the forefront, perfect for the melodramatic nature of many of the story's misunderstandings and dramatic confrontations. The distance between notes is now only slightly farther apart, but with the cello playing much lower than the piano's lowest note, the distance seems much farther, as we now feel grounded while the violins playing in the middle register run up and down, drifting out of the 2-octave cage we'd had before. The addition of the viola line moving independently of the 2 violins also adds in a third distinct voicing, giving the sort of flowing tears effect more validity as the strings take on their own lines, unlike how the caged piano barely moved at all and only just enough to consider it 2 lines. The piano comes back in, seemingly adding a bit more rhythmic structure to the piece as the strings repeat their pattern again, only for the following phrase to immediately break from any attempt at caging the piece into a confined space, with the first violin flying up to the upper register to add in another distinct string voicing. What sounds like it may be another repetition of what we just heard with an additional melody line is shifted as the instruments move to change the key. Having changed to a higher key, the instruments shift the pattern up with it, creating a more frantic sound while filling out the texture with electronic drums to create a larger-than-life range for the instruments. Despite the presence of only 5 acoustic instruments and a synthesized drum, the texture has completely filled out, and a complete orchestral range is the result. We started in a sort of box-like situation and slowly worked up to the point where all the emotions have burst and can't be contained. The key change was something like a hiccup or lost train of thought as the emotional character in question tried and failed to move beyond their feelings, falling victim to them even harder with the entrance of the drums. And as a final compositional trick, the drums and piano drop out for the last 4 bars without warning, while the first violin drops back down to the middle register, removing many of the open orchestral elements of the ensemble and suddenly containing it once again. This not only creates a huge contrast between the rich texture we heard a moment ago and now, but also leaves us with an empty feeling. All the build-up from before was suddenly wiped away as if cast aside, and this all leads to the assumption that the piece we were just listening to had far more instruments and orchestrations than it actually did. It also matches the tone of giving up after the terrible revelation, something many of the characters understand all too well. And that basically covers the main reasons the emotional tracks are able to capture the unique melodrama of the story. The use of atmospheric reverberations and sparse, widely divided melody textures, minimalist patterns repeating with slight changes and evolutions over long periods of time, and the overall scale and build-up of small ensembles to make them sound larger than what seemed possible when the piece began. So let's have a listen to one final track, probably my favorite piece from the soundtrack, Soshite, and we'll go through how it manages to utilize all of these to capture every bit of Nagiyasu's essence in the span of 3 minutes and 44 seconds. Within the first 5 seconds, we've already established the basis for all of the composition techniques we've been discussing. First, the atmosphere is established with a synthesized drone, playing a cluster pad of tones in E major. This cluster plays continuously throughout the piece, always keeping the sort of ringing, airy effect that keeps the piece together no matter where it may shift and sway. Second, one of 2 pianos begins playing an extremely minimalist pattern that only spans 1 bar, repeating over and over while other patterns gradually get layered on top of it. And third, this pattern on its own is fairly simple and stays in the middle register, beginning like the previous piece in a sort of confined box that's waiting to burst free. Contrary to what the title of the track might imply, this piece evolves quite dramatically and not exactly in the sort of romantic way that one might expect. And this is due to the actual context of when this piece is heard. This track plays a few times throughout the show, most notably during both Ofunekihi scenes and the second Tomoebi, and is meant to represent not just the melodramatic love polygon and the feelings associated with it, but rather the wrath of the sea god, embroiled in his own undying sadness and loneliness as he attempts to take a true human sacrifice in place of the ritualistic statues of countless past generations. And thus this repetitive pattern represents the impatience of the sea god as the years go by and nothing changes. The additional layered piano pieces build until each minimalist melody is obscured by the others. It sounds chaotic, yet it is based on formal and repetitive structures, never changing but becoming more and more difficult to separate. Vocal chants and whispers flicker in and out on top of the piano melody, conjuring images of Ojoshi-sama as the sea god laments the fate that became of her, leading to his endless years of suffering and spite. For a brief moment, they come to the forefront as the original piano melody drops out, giving a bit of breathing room before our first low instrument, the cello, smoothly creeps its way in. And then there's a slight pause as only one rising piano line and a relatively high cello note are left for a single bar, the calm before the storm. Suddenly the cello is replaced with a distant double bass, washed out with reverb but contributing a low rumble like the sound we have associated with being underwater. The simple rising piano line is replaced with the more complex pattern from the beginning, only now there are slight variations in it. As if the feelings the sea god had been keeping mostly hidden are beginning to leak out beyond his control, breaking through the stoicism of countless generations. The rest of the string quintet gently begins to build underneath the patterns repeating in the piano, increasing the scale and sound of the ensemble as the range of sounds begins to grow with each passing moment. And then there's a lapse as the voice comes to the forefront in somewhat unintelligible words, chanting the same thing over and over above the clashing piano lines, cutting out the strings and introducing the synthesized drum kit as it taps away on the hi-hat. As the strings come back in, they swell up and down like waves, curling and crashing at the edge of the sea. Each repetition sees the distance between the highest and lowest notes getting further apart until finally what little restraint the sea god had left is finally broken, bursting into a frantic piano line running over a new set of 4 notes while the drums, strings, vocals, and synth are merely a wash of different rhythms and patterns, crashing and mixing with one another as the slowly building tension from before is all released at once. Finally, as the release of tension seems like it will overwhelm everything around it, all the instruments cut out, leaving an empty space with only the E major cluster continuing to drone on. Like a massive tsunami leaving complete destruction in its wake, the wave recedes, and all that's left are the survivors and an almost deafening silence. The piano has a few final notes to close out the piece, but it leaves us hanging on an unresolved cadence. The sea god has been appeased, at least for the time being, and so he returns to his slumber without a care for the lives left in the wake of his destruction. Nagi no Asukara certainly isn't the first or last show to use these kinds of techniques to assist in the anime's world building, but it definitely is one of the better examples. Especially in a series that relies just as much on its unique setting and world as it does on its characters' conflicts, these kinds of film-like approaches to sound and music are essential in raising the artistry from good to great. But I'm also super biased towards this show because I love it unconditionally. And while it's not my second favorite anime anymore, it still holds a special place in the melodramatic part of my heart. But what did you guys think of Nagiasu's music though? And what other shows do you think can compete with this one on a sound direction and musical scale? Let me know down below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow my other accounts, all that good stuff. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.